Salams, this is the daily debrief coming to you from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi with me, Siddhant Ani. On the show today, some good news from Ecuador, where a court has acquitted cybersecurity expert and digital rights activist Ola Bini. In India, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has announced the country's budget for the upcoming financial year. We look at the key points from the document. And finally, 2 years after the current military regime took over in Myanmar, there are no signs of a move towards democracy, while the international community continues to be largely indifferent. First up, Swedish software developer and digital rights activist Ola Bini was acquitted of charges of hacking a computer. The order came on Tuesday by a court in Quito. The activist was acquitted unanimously by a tribunal of 3 judges after delivering nearly a 4.5-hour-long statement. Bini has faced persecution from the Ecuadorian state since 2019, and legal proceedings against him have been marred by several irregularities. Anish has been following Bini's case closely and joins us now. Anish, good to have you, particularly today, because we're at the top of our rundown and we're discussing a positive story from the point of view of digital rights activist Ola Bini, who's been prosecuted for the past close to 4 years, getting a unanimous acquittal there from the Ecuadorian court. Despite the internet gods playing a bit of havoc with our show, we have you back. So tell us as soon as you can before we have another mishap. What's been happening in the trial so far, and why is even the defense team looking at this current or judgment as a bit of a surprise?
Well, the surprise is primarily because of the record of how this entire procedure against him has happened over the past nearly 4 years. It would be for this April. He was arrested on the same day as Assange was dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy in London. We remember that. The government in Ecuador at the time, Lenin Moreno, tried to pin him with the blame of destabilizing the government and even election interference in the United States, of being a Russian hacker, and so on and so forth. There was like a wide variety of accusations made, none of which actually ever reached the court. Let's remember that. In fact, we have to remember the fact that he was detained and arrested and kept under detention without any contact with the outside world for hours, without any charges either. So this was how things began. Since then, we have seen multiple procedural violations. He had to be released because of that after 70 days under detention. 2 judges had to be changed over the time of this entire procedure. The first one had to recuse himself because he was found to be acting at the behest of the government at the time. The second one had to be removed because he kept unnecessarily delaying the entire procedure and trial, allowing prosecutors to keep changing goalposts, even charges. Multiple times you've seen charges being revised because they pretty much did not have any evidence to go up against him. And we even saw a prime witness, an expert witness that was presented by the defense of Ola Bini being hounded in Ecuador as well, simply because he wrote an entire report on the procedural violations and the charges leveled against Ola Bini, exposing the problems with the manner in which the whole judicial process was compromised. So at the end of all of that, after nearly a year of a trial and presentation of evidence and so on, we see this sort of verdict coming out where the judges not only concede the fact that Ola Bini is not guilty of the one charge that the prosecution did manage to pin on him, which was of non-consensual access to a computer system, a very broad sort of charge, simply because he had accessed a web page which required a password and user ID, and he did it without doing that. So because of that, they tried to pin him. Because even in the earlier charges, we have to remember they just couldn't find the victims of the crime that he supposedly committed. So at the end of the day, when they came up with this fact, and also the fact that such frivolous claims or even actions which may even be very important for somebody like him, who is a security advisor, a digital security advocate, and a privacy advocate. This is something quite crucial to and part of their work, and also for journalists, even in terms of reporting, like accessing a page that might have a password. If the judges had accepted that that breaks the law, then that only opens the Pandora's box of charging a whole host of other people. So this is definitely a very welcome judgment on behalf of the three judges who gave a unanimous verdict.
Right. The prosecutor's office, though, is saying that it will mount an appeal. How many steps are there for the prosecution to continue with its targeting of Ola Bini? And Anish, also very quickly, if you can add to that, what this sort of verdict in terms of the impact it might have on a wider scale for cybersecurity experts to perhaps think of Ecuador as a place in which the legal framework allows them to operate with some degree of safety?
Yes, beginning with the appeals process, we have to wait and see how far it goes, because at this throughout the trial process, the present if when we look at the kind of testimonies that the prosecution presented and the sort of evidence that they presented, they were trying to pretty much create a character. Profile of Ola Bini rather than actually prove him of actually doing something illegal in Ecuador. So this shows that there was from the get-go they had very little evidence of him having actually done anything wrong to begin with, and much less to even substantiate the charge that they had against him. So, but we have to wait and see. Sometimes there are issues. We have seen how the judiciary has been compromised in the past. That how political interference can affect the manner in which judges decide. So we have to wait and see how the appeals process go through. But in the strictest of terms, in the legal sense, there is almost no case to be had against Bin. If you look at the impact on the largest scale, it is quite significant, considering the fact that it is perhaps the first such case of that is related to info communications or telecommunications systems. And because obviously almost every country we know today has some or the other kind of legal framework on digital crimes and computer abuses, but the laws are very often very arbitrarily applied. Most of the time, there is no clear definition, and many times the governments do not even talk to experts on the matter, or hacktivists and so on, digital rights activists, and they come up with something that is very broad and and can be used against activists all the time. So this is kind of like a landmark in many ways, as I said, because the judges refused to consider the prosecution's claim that just because he accessed a web page, which required a password, doesn't mean that he did something illegal under the definitions of the law, which actually makes it safer for a whole host of privacy experts, consultants in the country who not only includes those who work for pay, but also includes those who work as for the common good, like Ola Bini, having a better framework now, a more clear, more clarity on the legal framework now to operate within Ecuador. So this is definitely a landmark in that sense, and obviously for not just for Ecuador in many ways, but also for the larger region.
Yeah, and perhaps also giving the prosecution something to think about. I guess because if a higher court also goes down the same road, then that sets an even higher precedent for the future. Yeah. So more trouble for governments in that case to contend with. All right, thank you very much for that update, Anish. We'll see you on the show very soon. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has announced the Union Budget for 2023-24 in India's Parliament, presenting on the one hand the idea of inclusive growth, but on the other a document in which the central allocation for a range of schemes intended to benefit the country's poorest reductions across the board. The Narendra Modi-led BJP government has slashed budgetary allocations for the much-talked-about Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, as well as the Department of Agriculture and Farmers' Welfare, rural self-governance, subsidies on food, and allocations to the Labour Ministry and its welfare schemes. The working class, therefore, is set to take a major hit. Senior journalist Paranjoy Guha Thakurta has been analysing the budget document and is with us now to talk through the key points. Paranjoy, welcome to Daily Debrief. Good to have you in the studio with us today, talking about a big day in the fiscal calendar for India, the announcement of the budget. What, according to you, are the key bits, both from an omission as well as a commission point of view?
Thank you, Siddhant, for asking me to speak on this program. This is the last budget of the Union Government of India, the last full-fledged budget of the Union of India before the next general elections. There will be another presentation of a vote on account, but not a full-fledged announcement. And what is significant about this budget is that it is clearly populist. It is clearly trying to woo the very sections of India's population, running into 1.4 billion, that have arguably suffered the most in the last 9 years, or almost 9 years, of the present right-wing Hindu nationalist ruling regime. Take the very first sentence of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman's budget speech. She says, "We envision a prosperous and inclusive India in which the fruits of development reach all regions and citizens, especially our youth, women, farmers, OBCs, other backward classes, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes." You can argue that India's growth in the recent past has been far from inclusive. Farmers have been up in arms. You could argue that the very sections of the population that she addresses in her first sentence are worse off today because of inflation. She doesn't mention inflation anyway. She talks about the international economic crisis and the recession, but she doesn't mention inflation in India. She talks about schemes that are going to create jobs, but she doesn't talk about the fact that unemployment in India is at a peak. I mean, when compared to the situation that prevailed 45 years ago. And this is what the government's own data shows. I think the most significant aspect of this budget is her attempt to woo the middle classes, the tax-paying middle classes. Maybe a few 100,000 people will benefit, or a few 100,000 families would benefit, but they're significant because they belong to the very vocal and influential middle classes.
Right.
5 years ago, a similar set of concessions on personal income tax were announced by the finance minister. So it's clearly, budget is a pre-election budget aimed at showing how, for the 75th year of India's political independence, she's saying the world has recognized the Indian economy as a bright star. So like all finance minister, she's paid by the taxpayer of India to be optimistic. And she tries to paint a very rosy picture of what's happening and downplays the negative aspects.
Right. One of the negative aspects, Paranjoy, that we've seen over the past few years has been, from a political perspective, as much as an economic perspective. Of course, you pointed out the sections that she's supposedly addressing in the opening line of her speech. The lack of inclusion has been as much on the political front as it has been on the economic front. And irrespective of how much the government spends on populist measures, the polarizing politics in the country continue to sort of intensify in the build-up to the general elections you were mentioning.
You know, the government claims it's spending more. For instance, it says it's going to spend 66% more on a housing scheme. But when you look at the fine print of the budget, you see that on several heads, there's not been an increase. In many cases, there's been a decline. For instance, after interest payments, The biggest item of expenditure in the budget of the government of India are subsidies. And within subsidies, it is subsidies on food, fertilizers, and then petroleum products like cooking gas. Now, if you compare what the government claims is a revised estimate for the current financial year that ends on the 31st of March 2023, and what the government claims would be the budget estimates for the 12 months that begin on the 1st of April 2023, you'll find huge discrepancies. If you look at the total figure, expenditure on food, fertilizer, and petroleum products, it's down 28%, comparing the revised estimate and the budget estimate. Specifically, in the case of food, it's down by almost over 30%. In the case of fertilizer, it's come down by around 22%. In the case of petroleum products, it's come down by 75%. Of course, the government can spend more at a later point of time. It can have what are called supplementary demand for grants. But this is one example of the double speak of the government. Your speech gives an indication that you're doing such a lot. You talked about the world's biggest free food scheme for 800 million Indians. That's like out of 1.4 billion people, 800 million people are being given. You reiterate a scheme you've already talked about. You're giving them free food for this entire calendar year. But you look at the budgetary allocations, and that is a different story altogether. That's correct.
All right, thanks very much for that, Paranjoy. And hope to have you back on the show at a later stage to talk more in detail about what's happening in India. And finally, pro-democracy activists in Myanmar held a silent strike to mark 2 years since the country's latest military takeover, urging civilians to stay indoors and businesses to remain closed in solidarity with those who have been killed and displaced in this period. Some 1.2 million people have been displaced and over 70,000 have left the country, according to the United Nations, which has accused the military junta of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Meanwhile, from the international community, there has been inaction bordering on indifference, even though the UK, the US, Canada and Australia announced some fresh sanctions against army-linked firms. Abdul Rahman is with us for details. Abdul, 2 years of the military junta ruling in Myanmar, protests have been held, but also signs that the powers in place are likely to extend martial law, the state of emergency in the country. What is the latest that you're hearing from reports on the ground?
Well, it seems that military is going to consolidate its power, despite the resistance, despite the protest, despite the international call for talks with democratic forces in the country. It seems military is in no hurry, in no mood at this moment to basically do any such thing. Given the fact that they are not in very uncomfortable position also. If you see, most of the country is quite comfortably under their control. Wherever there is resistance, they are free to use as much violence as they can. As per UN report, within 6 months, between July and December last year, 78 different locations, 78% of cities and townships across Myanmar saw such kind of action by the military. It shows that how widespread is their watch, and in every minute attempt to question their legitimacy is put basically brutally put down. Thousands of people have died, hundreds of people have been executed for resisting this. So it seems, and over and above that, if you see, when it comes to international actions, if you see, the US on one hand talks about human rights and takes actions against different other countries. In Myanmar, military junta has been invited in different military conferences and regional conferences. So it seems that Myanmar military is in no hurry, and there is no need for them to hurry.
You mentioned, Abdul, the role of the United States and, of course, also the wider international community. There are some nations, including Australia and others, who have levied some sanctions. But it seems like sanctions is the only way to solve this kind of, and we've seen the kind of impact unilateral or even multilateral sanctions have had on the humanitarian situation, and Myanmar is no exception to that, I would imagine.
See, that is a tricky question. When we talk about sanctions, we know ultimately the people in a country which basically become the sufferer for all those actions. We have seen it in various cases. There are multiple examples now, and therefore prescribing sanctions as the way to kind of pressurize the military junta there to kind of negotiate with the democratic forces is no one's case here. It's basically the active involvement with the military junta to basically persuade them to kind of, in a way, that they start negotiating with the opposition forces, with the democratic forces in that country, instead of repressing them. How to do it? Of course, the UN is allowed to go visit the leaders in country. The regional groupings of which Myanmar is a member, for example, ASEAN, can do something about this. But it seems that most of the regional groupings and the countries which have some influence over the Myanmar military have decided not to do anything.
Put any kind of pressure, right?
We don't know what could be the reason behind this
inaction.
Indifference, inaction. But because this is not happening for the first time. Military junta had been in power before in Myanmar also, and for a quite long period. Even when the Rohingyas were forcefully expelled out of the country, thousands, hundreds of thousands of them living in refugee camps all across the world, it seems the amount of action which the international community would have taken seems invisible. If you see the activity on the level of Ukrainian war and compare it with what is happening in Myanmar, because if you see the number of casualties, there is hardly any difference.
Right.
As per the UN report, more than 20,000 people died in Myanmar last year. Almost similar figures are coming from Ukraine. So in terms of human suffering, there is hardly any difference. But in terms of political action to resolve this crisis, there is a sea difference. And that difference has no explanation.
How do we see things proceeding from here, Abdul? If you can just sort of give us a sense of that very quickly before we wrap up.
It is very difficult. As I said before, junta is in no hurry, and it seems they are going to stay there for at least sometimes to come in future.
All right. Thanks very much, Abdul. We'll have you back on the show, I'm sure, very soon. Thanks for your time today. That's all we have on the show today from all of our guests and myself and the entire team here at People's Dispatch. Thank you very much for watching. We'll be back again tomorrow. But until then, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for details on these stories and all of the other work we do. Don't also forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.